Lecture 16 setteth forth the nature of sin in its several names, definition, effects, and aggravations. Matthew 6, verse 12. Forgive us our debts. Having explained this petition positively and practically, we come to handle those questions which may make to the clearing of that question which is contained in the text. And I shall pitch upon those that are useful and necessary, not on thorny and perplexed. God indeed once spake out of the thorny bush, but seldom doth truth discover herself in those thickets which the schoolmen have made. The first in order that should be discussed is what remission of sin is, or what is meant when we say God doth forgive sin. But before we can come to that, another doubt must be rolled out of the way, and that is what sin is, and what are the proper effects of sin. For a man can never understand what it is to have sin blotted out or taken away unless he first be informed what the nature of sin is, and what effects it hath wrought upon the sinner. Of this, therefore, in the first place, I shall speak of sin abstractly, in its own nature. Secondly, relatively to the person who sinneth. Thirdly, the proper effects of it. Fourthly, the weight or aggravation of every sin. Let us begin with the former. Sin in the Scripture hath several names, which do in some measure describe the nature of it. The Hebrew chata is used commonly for sin, and it doth in a proper signification, whence it is once used, denote an aberration from the mark we shot at. Judges 20, verse 16. Everyone could sling stones at an hair's breadth and not miss. And from hence metaphorically is signified the nature of sin, for every man's action is to have an end, which end is manifested by the Scripture. And when a man reacheth not to this, he is said to sin. Answerable unto this word, in the Greek, is amagtia, which comes from amagtano, that is, to err from the scope, and another word, pagabasis, which is going beyond the bounds and limits which are set us, though a learned critic, Deu, doth make para not to signify beyond, but by, as if it did denote a negligent and careless passing by the commands of God. Another word is avaz, in the Hebrew, which cometh of a word that properly signifieth crookedness and obliquity in the body, and so is applied to the soul, and doth denote perverseness in him that sinneth. And to this may answer anuth, anamuth, where the particle alpha is not to be understood privatively only, but adversatively, for a mere want of the law may not be a sin always, but a repugnancy must necessarily be. And thus the word is used, 2 Thessalonians 2:8 and 1 Timothy 4:9. The Hebrews also express sin by pasha, which is as much a defection or falling off from God, and answerable to this in the Greek is paraploma, which is a falling away from that integrity and purity we either had or ought still to have. As for the Latin word peccatum, some have derived it from pelicar, which is to commit adultery, as if a sin were so called in the general from one kind of it, and others from pecus, because a man in sin wanders like a beast, or becomes like a beast. Yet many conceive the word peccare to be a theme itself, and not derived from any other word. As for the definition of sin, what it is, though there have been many disputes about it, and Chemenitis wished for one public definition of it, to which all churches should agree, yet certainly that of John is full and comprehensive enough. 1 John 3, verse 4. Sin is the transgression of the law. Answerable whereunto is that, 2 Samuel 15, verse 24. I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord. Only you must remember not to limit anumia to a mere want of the law, but as comprehending that which is against it. Now, this definition agreeth both to habitual and actual sins. To habitual, whether it be that innate and inbred of original sin, or whether it be that habitual voluntarily contracted, you have both the actual and habitual anomia, excellently put together, Romans 6, verse 19, as you have yielded your members servants to iniquity unto iniquity. Where by the former iniquity is meant original and habitual sin, by the latter actual sin, as the fruit of the former. It hath been doubted how habitual, especially original sin, can be called truly sin, because it is not voluntary. For that voluntariness should be of the nature of sin, is so universally acknowledged that neither Doctorum Pausitis nor In Doctorum Turba do dissentire. Neither the few learned men or the many unlearned did ever gainsay, said Austin. And besides, all sin must be forbidden by a law. Now, how are we forbidden to be born without sin? Would not such a prohibition be ridiculous? Again, the commands of God seem to be for good actions, not for the habits of good actions. Now, although it might fairly be maintained that to anomon, not to uer egtikon, the transgression of a law and not voluntariness, is of the nature of a sin. For the Apostle in Romans 7:15 saith, He doeth that which he would not do. And there are many sins of ignorance, which must necessarily be without any express act of the will. Yet we may with Austin call this sin voluntary, taking voluntary as it comprehends the will of Adam, that universal person and principle in whom we all willed. And by this means, though infants are not in themselves capable of any precept, much less before they were born, which they were to accomplish in their own person, yet they were bound up in a command even before they had an actual being in Adam, in whose will they were to fulfill that command. For that command was not given to Adam as a single person, but as an universal. Hence it is that habitual sin, whether remote or proximate, is forbidden by the law of God, which requireth not only good things to be done, but also that they flow from a clear and pure fountain within, even an entire perfection of the nature. So that although infused habits of grace come not under a precept in respect of the infusing and ingenerating of them, for that is God's act, and we are not bound to do that, yet they are commanded both before they are infused and after. Before by the law, which requireth of us that inward rectitude which is now lost, and after they are infused, to be diligent in those pious actions, whereby those habits may be preserved and retained. So that by this we may see a sin to be whatsoever doth transgress the law of God, whether habitually or actually, whether internally or externally, whether by commission or by omission, and from hence ariseth the curse which the law pronounceth against sinners, because it is broken by them. In the next place, if we speak of sin as it relates to the person sinning, so there is not required, first, that a man should not intend sin, and will it as sin, for that is impossible, even as the understanding cannot assert to anything false as false, but as the object is either true really or apparently. So neither can the will desire anything that is evil as evil, but as it is apparently good. As the devil appeareth in Samuel's clothes, so doth sin and evil always under the notion of some good or other. Hence the Apostle saith, Lusts saves. I do deleadzain, entice a man, as a fisherman doth the silly fish by the bait upon the hook, which the Apostle elsewhere calls pa ealau saith, a deceiving or putting a false syllogism upon ourselves, so that they do not sufficiently vindicate the pure providence of God from sin, who say, God doth will the act, but not the deformity, or the evil of it. For so neither doth man will expressly the evil of an act, although in willing that act to which sin is necessarily annexed, it be interpretively to will the sin. Neither, secondly, is to sin, to produce sin, as the proper and immediate terminus of our action. For sin being a privation, or at most a relation, it cannot be the immediate effect of any action. Sin is not indeed a mere pure privation, such as blindness is, but mixed and compounded, such as sickness is, which hath both the inordinacy and want of a good temperament, and also the ill humours of it. So that a man sinneth by producing or doing that action to which sin is annexed. And herein neither do they sufficiently clear God's concourse about sin in saying it goeth to the material act of sin, but not the immediate obliquity of it. For so neither doth man, and indeed sin being a privation, or as some a relation, it is impossible it should be produced any other way, but by that act unto which it is joined to, as theft is committed by doing that material action to which that deformity is inseparably adjoined. Therefore to sin is to do a thing deficiently from the law of God, so that God, in all those several acts of his about sin, whether they be permissive or ordinative, is gloriously vindicated, because he doeth nothing deficienter, as failing from that eternal and immutable law of righteousness, whereas the angels and man did, missing or coming short of the rule by which they were to be guided. But because this discourse is more remote to our present matter of pardon of sin, we come to that which doth more nearly concern it. Therefore, in the third place, there is the proper effect and consequent of sin, which is to make guilty and oblige to eternal wrath. To remit the many things that are in sin, divines do acknowledge two things in every sin: the macula, or filth, and the retus, the guilt. Which guilt some do again distinguish into the guilt of sin, which they call the inward dignity and desert of damnation, which they make inseparable from sin, even as heat is from the fire, and the guilt of punishment, which they make separable. For the present, let us examine, what is that effect of sin, whereby a man, when a sin is committed, is truly denominated a sinner. Foreseeing remission as a taking away of sin in that respect, whereby we are adjudged and accounted as sinners, it is necessary to know what that is, which doth so constitute a sinner. As for example, David after his adultery, Peter after his denial, have contracted such a guilt upon them, whereby they are accounted as sinners, though the acts of their sins be gone and past. And in this condition, they stand, till remission or forgiveness come, which takes away their sins. For the understanding of this, consider this foundation, that every sin committed by a man, though the sin be transient, and quickly passeth away, yet it doth still continue, and it is as it were still in acting, till by remission it be removed.